Water. Without it, life would not have evolved as we know it. We use enormous amounts of it every day, and the supply of water is a continual and increasing problem. Although engineers are working on ways of purifying salt water, it seems likely that we shall have to rely for a long time on man-made reservoirs to collect our rainfall. This is the story of such a reservoir, from its conception and construction to its effect on the local environment. Burrator Reservoir, lying to the southwest corner of Dartmoor in Devon, is the main supply to Plymouth 12 miles to the south. 2 pipelines take the water to the treatment works at Crown Hill, where it meets an additional supply from the River Tavy. The energy induced in the water by gravity, due to the height of the reservoir, is used to generate electricity for use at the works. Chemicals, including aluminium sulfate and sodium aluminate, are added to control purity. But in view of the high quality of Dartmoor's water, only partial dosing is required. The chemicals, called coagulants, form a jelly to which impurities adhere, and then both are filtered out by passing the water through sand. Later, lime is added to control acidity, and a final injection of chlorine ensures freedom from bacteria. The clean water then passes to a storage reservoir for distribution throughout the city. Plymouth has not always been so fortunate in being able to draw upon the freshwaters of Dartmoor. Until 1590, Plymouth relied upon wells sunk in the limestone beneath the town, and even today their names are preserved as in Ladywell, Buckwell and Finewell. During the 16th century, the growth of the town and its development as a port of strategic value placed great demands on the meagre water supply. And in 1580, an act was passed which authorised the digging of a trench or ditch to bring water from the River Meavy 12 miles away. The work of cutting the ditch, or leat as it is correctly called, was entrusted to Sir Francis Drake, who was paid £200 for its construction. The first sod was cut in December 1590, and in only 4 months the 17 miles of leat was completed. The point at which the River Meavy was tapped, called Headweir, now lies under Burrator and could be seen during the severe drought of 1959. Drake's leat supplied water to the town for 300 years, until the reservoir was built and iron pipes were laid. But the leat is not forgotten, nor the foresight of the corporation and the role played by Drake in bringing water to Plymouth. Each year the waterworks are officially inspected by the Lord Mayor, a tradition handed down from the days of the leat. At the ceremony of the fishing feast, 2 goblets filled with water from Headweir are passed amongst the select gathering and a toast proposed.
To the pious memory of Sir Francis Drake.
The goblets are then refilled with wine and the guests drink again.
May the descendants of him who brought us water never want for wine.
Then follows the feast itself, at which trout from the reservoir is eaten. In the early days of the fishing feast, the trout was taken from the leat, but now Burrator supplies the catch. In 1793, a second leat was built to serve Devonport, and its route can still be followed across the moor between Burrator and north of Princetown. To feed the leat, water is taken from 3 rivers, the Blackbrook, the Cowsick and the West Dart. This is the Cowsick Weir, which controls the flow of water, sited high up on bleak moorland. Close to the famous Fogstore Myres is Nuns Cross Farm, now uninhabited, where the leat goes underground for half a mile. It follows a gradual downhill path until it would appear that the engineer, unable to find a suitable contour, sent the water tumbling down into the Meavy Valley in desperation. The leat is carried over the river by an iron-troughed aqueduct. Occasionally, repair work is necessary, which may require the flow of water to be reduced or cut off altogether. These sluice gates, at intervals along the Leat, make this possible by diverting the water into another channel. The bank is being rebuilt with granite blocks to stop leakage. In this case, the reduced flow is being carried past the workings through a pipe, the Leat having been temporarily dammed. Therefore, the water supply is maintained during operations. Cutting bracken and removing weed is just one of the regular maintenance jobs undertaken throughout the year to keep the water as pure as possible. Most of the water in the Devonport Leat supplies the areas around Dowsland via its own treatment works, but a proportion is diverted into the reservoir, adding to the total amount eventually reaching Plymouth. The supply of water by open Leat suffered two main drawbacks. In summer and autumn it could dry up. In a severe winter it could freeze or become choked with snow. This happened during the Great Blizzard of 1891, and it was this that undoubtedly added weight to plans for a reservoir. Two sites were proposed, both on the River Meavy, but one at Harter and the other at Head Weir, about 2.5 miles apart. Conservation and controversy are not new words, for even in 1880, when plans were first drawn up, there was heated argument over the sites. The Harter site, near Blacktor, would probably have caused least disturbance to farmland, but it was further from Plymouth, was supplied by only 2 rivers, and due to the shallow valley, a longer and more expensive dam would have been needed. The Battle of the Sites, a term used by the local press, was no exaggeration. The Water Committee could not reach agreement and resigned en masse. The matter was put to public vote, and Head Weir was chosen. Regrettably, the scheme failed when decomposed granite was found at the dam site, and in 1889 an alternative plan was proposed. This was to be Burrator, and soon Plymouth would have a reliable and plentiful water supply. Fed by 3 rivers and surrounded by tors and hills, the geography was ideal. It would provide a catchment area of 8 square miles, with a rainfall nearly twice the average of that at sea level. The highest peaks are Leathertor and Peak Hill to the north, and Sheepstor to the south. It would be necessary to build 2 dams, one little more than an earth embankment towards Sheepstor, the other being the main dam thrown across a narrow gorge of solid granite. The dam was to rely mainly on its own weight to hold back the mass of water. This type of construction is called a gravity dam, consisting of a core of granite boulders encased in a crust of interlocking granite stones. In 1893, work started on excavating for the foundations. The rock had to be cut entirely by hand, since explosives would weaken the foundations. It took 2 years of hard digging with picks and shovels to reach a completely solid base. 5 huge crevices of soft material had to be cleaned out and filled with concrete. During excavations, the River Meavy was carried past the workings on a huge wooden launder, designed to cope with the severest flood known to that area. Construction of the dam itself began in November 1895. A gravity dam must obviously be as heavy as possible, yet still be consistent with economy. In the method of construction known as cyclopean masonry, most of the weight comes from the huge granite boulders, which were prepared in a nearby quarry. Each one was carefully cleaned and set in concrete. In another quarry, stones were cut for the dam wall, which had to proceed at a similar pace. These stones, cut to precise measurements, were made to interlock with adjacent stones to provide a strong, watertight wall. When the wall reached the height of the Launder carrying the river, a culvert was built through the dam to take the main water outlets and to return a proportion of the original flow back to the river in compensation. Early in 1898, the dam had reached the water level point, and 5 arches were built to carry the roadway and to allow surplus water to flow over the dam and back into the river. By the autumn of 1898, 5 years after the start, the dam was complete, and at a simple ceremony the Lord Mayor of Plymouth closed a valve and the valley began to flood. For many, it was a time to look with nostalgia at a view never to be seen again. For a few, it was a turning point in their lives, the loss of their homes and their livelihoods, an unwilling sacrifice so that the many could have fresh water. Longstone Manor and the adjoining farm were built by Walter Elford in 1637. The farm buildings were lost beneath the water, but the manor house remains. Then owned by Sir Massey Lopez, one of the main contenders to the Burrator scheme, the farm at the time of flooding was the home of George Creeber and his family. They were evicted. The remains of a cider mill, probably one of the farm's industries, lies near the house. Millstones and an archway from the farm were later used to build a commemorative wall on the north shore. Little comfort for the inhabitants of 12 other farms and 5 cottages, well above the waterline, who thought they were safe from eviction. And so they were, until the corporation bought the catchment area in 1919, and 70 people lost their homes. Bill Legassick remembers those people well.
Yes, it was awful sad, and I suppose really, had them not gone then with the treatment that they've got for the water of today, well, it would hardly have been necessary for them to have went. Because it was good farms, you know. It was always considered that Dinkum, the top end of the reservoir, was a better farming land for cattle than what Sheepster Valley was. They did used to grow good cattle in Dinkum and Kingshead Valley. The old man Pengilly, from up the Coomshead, now he was the last to go, and it was in the agreement I've always been given to understand that the old Dickie boy, as he was always known as, was allowed to stay there as long as he lived. They used to lie rough back in those days, you know. They used to live on rabbits. That was their living. And that old Dickie Pengilly used to go down to Mavie, you know, and that was the nearest pub. He'd go down there and get tight and go home and stand beside the fire and dry it on it, you know. I've heard them say that they've seen the old Dickie boy out there with the steam going up over it. And then he said to me when I was a youngster, "You boys tell about looking after yourself," he said. "Oh, I've slept scores of nights," he said, "up on Ringmoor Down, northern it." He'd say, you know, and they was, it was tough times back in the days, there's no doubt about it. He was the last old boy to go from the watershed. Oh, Dickie Pengilly.
The Yelverton to Princetown branch of the Great Western Railway was opened in 1880 to provide transport for the people in the remote Princetown area. The line passed close to Burrator Reservoir, and living in Yeo Farm just below the dam was Ethel Bowden, a young girl at the time of the First World War, who vividly remembers one particular train.
Yes, we were living in an isolated farmhouse during the end of the First World War, and there was a rumour that the war was over. I had my two brothers and my fiancé in the war, and of course we were very anxious about them. And we had no telephone or radio or anything like that. The only thing we had was a newspaper. And we arranged with the station master at Dowsland, who was a friend of ours, if it was true that the war was over, would he arrange with the engine driver on the Princetown Railway to blow a shrill blast just as the train was rounding the bend opposite our farmhouse. When the blast did go, there was great rejoicing at our farm. What could you do on an isolated farmhouse but jump in the air and clutch each other? Yes, it was a happy day.
But the line was not profitable and closed in 1957. A driver who spent many years of his working life on that railway was Reg Ball.
When the railway was open first, there was Yowerton, Dowsland, Princetown. Eventually, smaller Alts was open, Burrator Alt, which was put up for the men who was building the extension of Burrator. Some came from around Arbridge, Yowerton, who came up by train, and others was from Princetown coming down. For the convenience of traffic going across, there was a temporary suspension bridge, similar to the one that they got at Bristol, the Clifton Suspension Bridge. You can still see where the foundations, each side of the suspension bridge is still there now. Two concrete square places you see, one each side of, say, about 50 to 100 yards down from the main dam that is now. Eventually, they decided to close the Princetown branch. Visitors came there purposely for the view. It was about 50-50. See the view going up, and the other 50% was to see the prison when they got there. I was one of the drivers that used to go up to bring away the sleepers and rails as they was taking it up. I went up on the last train. I didn't drive the last train. I rode up and had a ride back as the last trip over. I got a ticket. Still got the old railway ticket that I had to go up. More people patronised it that day than it was ever known. When they knew a thing was closed and they wouldn't have it no more, they wanted it. When they had it, they didn't want it. It's like everything. If you haven't got anything, you want it.
Dartmoor is well known for evidence of a prehistoric civilization. Hut circles and stone rows are perhaps the best known, an indication of how the moor's inhabitants lived 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. Much later, Dartmoor had a thriving industrial community, notable being tin mining, which, for 1,000 years, influenced its economic history. One thing vital to the small-scale production of tin was water. John Wesley explains.
Before the miner could sell his tin, the ore containing the metal had to be processed. This was done by heating the ore until the tin melted. Water provided power to drive bellows to raise the temperature of the furnace for this purpose. The miners constructed small buildings in which to do this work, and these are the remains of a typical blowing house, as it was called, at Blacktor on the River Meeby, about 2.5 miles from Burrator. It measured 17 feet 6 by 14 feet 9, was made of granite boulders, and probably had a thatched roof of turf or heather. This one was worked during the 17th century. In fact, records show that it was leased to Matthew Yandell and Roger Williams of Walkhampton in 1654. Water to drive the wheel was diverted from the river by means of a short lead. The wheel itself, about 9 feet in diameter, was mounted in this pit. and provided power to drive the bellows, a complicated affair made of wood and leather which supplied air to the furnace. The ore was crushed by stamps, which were rows of metal-tipped wooden beams mechanically operated by the wheel and dropped into granite mortar stones. Crushed ore was then put into the furnace in layers, alternating with charcoal from oak or alder wood. A blast of air from the bellows raised the temperature to around 230 degrees centigrade. The molten tin then ran into the float stone beneath the furnace. The tin would then have been transferred to a mould stone to await testing for purity and stamping by officials from the local stannery town, in this case probably Tavistock, after which it would be used in the manufacture of pewter and for a variety of other domestic purposes.
The beauty of Burrator is undoubtedly enhanced by trees, but it's not primarily for the sake of appearance that trees are cultivated with such care. It's to reduce erosion. Without some form of vegetation, water running down the surrounding slopes would carry soil with it, which eventually could fill the reservoir. Also, they tend to impede the flow of water, so that less will be lost over the dam. And of course, they provide a crop for sale later. In addition to hardwood, oak and beech, 4 separate varieties of conifer are cultivated: the Sitka spruce, Norway spruce, Japanese larch and Scots pine. And all from seed in Burrator's own nursery. Acorns are planted which, in over 100 years' time, will have grown to mature oak trees. Seed can be sown in ordinary soil, but it'll thrive better in a duneman bed, which is similar to the forest floor, consisting mainly of pine needles. About a year later, the tiny trees are lifted from the duneman bed to be replanted in properly spaced rows so that they have room to develop. The young trees are loaded into a framework which is positioned, soil placed around it, and then opened to leave them in neat rows. About 3 years later, the trees will be strong enough to be planted out, where they will grow to full size in 60 to 70 years' time, the lifespan of man. Depending on their size, age and quality, the trees are sold for either fencing stakes, pit props for coal fields, or as timber for joinery and building. The Norway spruce is popular as a Christmas tree, and in December of each year, a tall, well-shaped specimen is felled to be re-erected in Plymouth's Royal Parade. Felling a 70-foot tree, loading it onto a timber wagon, transporting it to Plymouth, and hoisting it on site without damage is no small task. In filthy weather, it's even harder. Despite high winds and torrential rain, the tree is safely delivered and adds to the festivities of the city. The endless cycle of nature at Burrator is no different from anywhere else. The colours of the landscape change with the seasons. Death anywhere is as much a part of life as birth itself. A pony dies, and a lamb is born. Dazzled by the evening sun and without ceremony, it begins its life, with only the ewe and the farmer concerned for its well-being. Man inevitably influences the ecology. To the farmer, the lamb means money. To the fox, it means food. So man has decided that the fox must die. Summer comes round again. The rhododendrons come into bloom and the fishermen take to the water. Burrator has seen many changes during its existence, now bearing little resemblance to the original valley. Once an industrious community of farmers and their families, now only water and trees remain. Essential for the life of the city, and beautiful too, but who can tell for how long it will remain that way?